Hey, Mac.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. And Rajesh says, my dad told me not to click on any URL. That's good thinking. Don't click on any URL ever. I highly recommend that strategy. It leads to many fewer problems. Um, so with that, let's talk about somebody who did click on a URL, apparently. Azure Active Directory. So we have a couple of notes that I want to get to, but first, Azure Active Directory is doing Azure Active Directory things again. Um, Service outage that's kind of preventing people from doing things like logging into services or getting stuff done, normal stuff. And I'm trying not to be too sarcastic about this. Uh, Anders says it's fixed now. So according to the Azure status, there are still authentication errors. Basically, current status is that they've rolled out a fix, and the error rate is rapidly decreasing. So it sounds like they tried to get it finished in time for Shop Talk, which is nice of them. I appreciate it. I do want to call out in the Shop Talk show notes that the last time there was a major Azure Active Directory outage, it was also right before an episode of Shop Talk. So are these things related? Probably. Almost 6 months ago. Yeah, it was about 6 months ago. Unfortunately, this kind of thing happens. We see Azure DevOps, the service goes out for a little while. We'll see Active Directory, the service goes out for a little while. And with these sorts of centralized services, if it goes out, it has a pretty big impact. I can't say I've never knocked over a server before, but not at that scale. So with that, I've done my due statement of look at that outage, poke the outage. Hey, you want to see a dead service? And so let's introduce the Shop Talk co-hosts tonight. Welcome in Mala Mahadevan. How you doing? So great. Although you were on mute the whole time.
So,
While she's
I'm
on,
feeling everyone doing fine.
and Mike Christensen. How you doing, Mike?
Doing very well. Thanks for asking. Hello, everyone.
Excellent. So Anders says, who hasn't accidentally tripped over a power cord in the server room? I have never tripped over a power cord in a server room. I'll let you interpret for yourself what that means. And Mala, you muted yourself again.
I have pushed the wrong reset button. I've done that.
Ooh. Yeah.
Many times.
That'll happen.
Back in the days when you sat next to each other with the boxes in the middle, you could reset somebody else's instead of your own. That used to happen. Push the button on the left and it's that guy's PC, not yours.
Solomon says, tripped or yanked?
They never let me in it, but I did sit near it, and the heat was nice.
Yeah. Well, when you go into one of those server rooms, the classic server rooms where it's 55 degrees and they have air conditioner blowing everywhere and people wearing gun range earphones so that they don't get tinnitus. Good times. And Rajesh says that's why they don't allow me into the room anymore. I mean, that is a legit reason why they don't allow people into server rooms, because we keep doing stuff like unplugging things. That would look cool if I pushed this button, and it turns out it's not quite as cool as we thought it would be. TG says, or announced 0.0.0.0/0 is reachable via single hop on the BGP4 router. Also not a great time. Took down the internet for a country. So now we know TG consulted for North Korea. Speaking of consulting for North Korea, Mala, the WIC group has updates. I actually had no way to tie that in as a transition, but I figured I'd give it a try. Wrong
So
continent.
the Women in Tech group, I'm trying to find the URL, but we are having, we had one day of, not a themed event. It was just a day of various tech presentations and some professional growth stuff, and it went really well. We had a great audience and everybody liked it. So we are doing another one instead of monthly webinars, which we used to have. We are doing quarterly events instead, day-long events. The next one is on popular demand. It's going to be on mental health and wellness. So anybody is welcome to submit. And we have the speaker submission open for a whole month. We also have a networking hour for women in tech or people who consider allies this Thursday at 6 o'clock. And I will post links to both shortly in chat. Thank you, Kevin.
Sure thing. Also, this Thursday, SQL Trail. So SQL Trail is a conference that Carlos El Chacon puts together as part of the SQL Data Partners podcast and associated enterprises. Historically, it's been an in-person conference, usually in or around Richmond, Virginia. This past year, it was a virtual conference. This year, it is also going to be virtual. And it sounds like he's trying to do a couple of events. So it's happening this Thursday. General admission is free. If you go to sqltrail.com, you can sign up. I'm going to be presenting there. Eugene Meidingers will be presenting, as well as Frank Levine and Gonzalo and Marcos will be presenting there. So check that out, sqltrail.com. PG says there are pictures of me going through an update during a session at SQL Saturday in Boston a few years ago. Windows updates picks weird times to restart, like the time you don't want it to.
Oh my. Oh, tell me about it.
Getting mad at me right now.
And then it's never the update that takes 30 seconds to complete. It's the update that takes 9 minutes to complete.
It's always at 35%.
Yep. AI perfected, exactly. So they took all of that AI that they took out of Clippy and put it into when to do Windows updates. And the problem is that the Clippy AI was so angry at having been taken out that it became malicious. And that's why Windows updates always happen at exactly the worst time. So actually, as a quick story of why I hate this world. Clippy was originally going to be an AI system. And it was based on your behaviors, based on what you would do. So for example, if you had Excel open and you spent a lot of time hovering over the view menu without clicking it, or you clicked it and you're hovering over a couple of options that are maybe introductory style of topics, then the help would automatically update and would focus on introductory articles. Hey, here's information on how to do some really basic stuff. Yeah, we pressed the rant button. Oh yeah, this is a rant. As you start working with pivot tables, so maybe you're hovering around view, it'll give you introductory articles. You create a pivot table. Suddenly it says, oh, you're not an introductory user. If you're working with pivot tables, you're manipulating those. So let me change this and make it more of advanced topics. So the help would update what its recommended topics were based off of the actions that you as a user were taking in Excel or in Word or whatever. This was going to be in Office 95. It was taken out of Office 95, not because it didn't work. The code worked, but the megabytes of space that it would take up were better used with extra clip art. They took out a functional artificial intelligence system that gave you intelligent querying for help because people needed more clip art. They replaced it with Clippy. Tink, tink, tink. Hello, it seems like you're writing a letter. Can I do something that's totally unhelpful? The answer is yes. Yes, you can, Clippy. So that's my rant about Clippy. Clippy actually could have been a realistic AI option and could have been actually useful. So our Microsoft says, welcome, what is the topic today? Well, so far, we've griped about Azure. I've complained about Office 95. And Mala has talked to us about something that's useful. So that's basically par for the course. All right. So Azure Active Directory, who needs it? The answer is apparently everybody. But sounds like AAD is coming back up, so that's good. And I think the after action story will be pretty interesting. The case of what actually happened. Sometimes companies do a really good job of, we had this was the process, this is what happened, and they make these reports public. Microsoft, not always. But, we'll see. The major Azure DevOps outage, I remember they had a pretty big public explanation of, this is what happened, this is why there was an outage, this is what we've done to try to rectify that in the future. And we'll see about Azure Active Directory. Given how big and important it was, I think they're going to have a public statement. So, the intern pushed the wrong code. A postmortem, thank you, Raymond. I was trying to remember what the term was. So, somebody I know was saying, actually, Anders, that right now downstream apps don't trust the new JSON Web Token. So that may indicate that maybe somebody might have made a change to some certificates without actually doing the right process. I don't know. That's my wild speculation based off of hearsay, which means that I should probably put it on Twitter and have it go viral. All right. Let's related to single sign-on? Yes. Related to single sign-on, related to integration with a lot of different apps. The apps themselves are running. The services themselves are running, but you're not able to connect to do much. Azure Key Vault, maybe. That's where the postmortem, thank you, Raymond, will be really helpful for us. So our major topic for tonight comes from Fred Elsenberry. Fred sent us a message, sent me an email, said, hey, I want to understand about modern data warehousing and get an idea of how some of the process works. So Anders says, I think it's with Azure, it's a root cause analysis. Same difference. But yeah, we'll be interested to see what the root cause was, what the process app was that led to this. How many outages does it take to make companies migrate back to on-premises?
Oh, that's not happening. That is not happening. Tech never goes backward. In case backward, I don't mean in any kind of bad way. I'm just saying it's rare that something as big as the cloud is going to get out of our way.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because I can see at the margin, I can see some companies say, we're not going to go this way. But then how many outages does an average company have? Hardware still fails on premises.
Right.
Hardware fails in the cloud.
Right.
Usually the hardware failures are not the major problems. Usually it's code failure. Mainframe mini workstation. Well, the cloud is basically today's mainframe.
Right.
So 15 years from now, we're going to have internet minis. Depends on the costs. Yeah, like what was the cost of this being out? For Azure Active Directory's outage, it affected developers a lot. It affected people trying to access things, but when I say things, I mean trying to access maybe Teams or Office or trying to access the Azure portal. So it did affect that for sure. But if you have your application that's depending on Azure SQL Database, or you're using Azure containers through AKS, the Kubernetes service, it sounded like those weren't affected. And it's similar to the outage in September, where basically same story. People had problems getting into the Azure portal. They didn't have problems accessing services that were running already. Bad for finance since it was right at the close of business. Yeah. Yeah. But then I do wonder in finance how much proper cloud usage there is. Outsourcing and back, cloud migration and back all the same, but good luck for all the people using something they can't bring back like a SQL database, says TG.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Multi-factor authentication might be an issue as well with logging in. Possibly. I don't know the details of this one, if it affected multi-factor auth on apps. Because they were making it sound like in this case that no, it was you could still access your applications, you just couldn't get to the portal. Or people had trouble connecting to Teams. So since you couldn't get to the first login, yeah. So we'll see. I guess we'll see what the scope of the outage was, but I'm not sure it really affected, say, end user applications as much as it could have. And again, that would be very similar to what happened back in September when Azure Active Directory was out. Now, if you're using Azure Active Directory to run your applications, might be a problem there.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk warehousing. And Fred's question was, hey, I want to learn about this hub and spoke data warehousing model.
Oh, I've not even heard of that name, Kevin. Want to know more? Hub and spoke? Okay.
Hub and spoke, yeah.
Mm.
So turns out that they're, like in everything else computer related, there's some multiple usage. There's some overloading of terms where hub and spoke means a couple of different things. So classically, there are two data models for warehousing. You've got the Kimball model and the Inman model. The Kimball model is called a bus architecture. Basically, you have fact tables. These are the measures, the interesting things, the data you want to collect. And you have dimensions. Dimensions are the descriptors, the who, what, and how that explain information about these measures that make it interesting. And the Kimball model is basically you collect all of this stuff in a central data warehouse, and you kind of partition it out just a little bit. So yeah, Rajesh, I think I'm hearing that echo as well. I don't think it's... Let me double check something here. We'll find out if it's from me or just includes me, but we'll see. So it might actually be Mala, where her microphone and speakers are near each other. Okay, problem solved. Thanks for pointing that out, Rajesh. So, all right, the classic model of the Kimball bus architecture. Let me see if I can... Last time I did this, it was a train wreck. But for people who are on Twitch, sorry, Mike and Mala, you won't be able to see this very well. I'm going to switch over to the development view, and we'll see a picture of the Kimball bus architecture. So in case you want to see that, here's the link. And the idea of this architecture is essentially, I'm pulling in data from a bunch of different sources. And I'm going to pull it together in this central location, the central warehouse. And then we're going to build out specialized data marts for relevant business units. So those data marts are going to have some subset of the facts and dimensions that are relevant to the particular business. This is the data model that has been in play for data warehousing for decades at this point. It is a useful model and does a really good job of what it's supposed to do. By contrast, you had the hub and spoke model. So this is also known as the Inman Model, named after Bill Inman. And the idea is that you have the same data sources, but your ETL process actually takes you to a third normal form style data warehouse. So the Kimball model is facts and dimensions, and kind of looks like a star schema, where you have the fact in the middle, and you have all of your dimensions kind of spider webbing around it. For the Inman model, from your third normal form warehouse, you build out your data mart, and you'll notice that it's essentially a shared copy of a lot of data. So the coloration difference, how this includes all of the mess of data. By contrast, that Kimball style, if I go back to the image, you see that it only includes some of the elements. So the payment model includes payment data plus some of the common attributes, some of the common information for payment, but it's still business focus. Hub and spoke, that Inman style, basically across the board. Think of it as miniature copies of the larger data set shaped for individual business units. Now, why am I talking about this? Because that was the original concept of hub and spoke. You have your warehouse, it's broken out into a bunch of copies. People access the copies rather than the central warehouse. So there was a presentation from Elias Butterfield back when Azure SQL Data Warehouse was a thing, before it became Azure Synapse Analytics. And he was talking about the hub and spoke model for Azure SQL Data Warehouse. What's interesting about this is it was kind of a hybrid approach of Kimball and Inman, where you have the Kimball style centralized data warehouse that is fact and dimensional. Azure SQL Data Warehouse works really well with fact dimensional models, with star schemas. It works really not well for heavily normalized tables, for heavily normalized warehouses. So it's intended for that Kimball model. But in this video, Elias shows how to use Elastic Pools and Azure SQL Database to create a bunch of external tables. So essentially, you're making copies of the data, or at least links to the data. And I believe that's what Fred is getting at with hub and spoke in a modern data warehouse. So it gets kind of interesting because I don't know that that's a great model. And let me wave my hands a bit and tell you why. So the main workload for something like Azure SQL Data Warehouse, or now Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools. The main workload is mostly long-running batch jobs. They run for a while, process a lot of data, give you back some results, or reports. Generally, you know what you're asking for, you know the types of questions that you're asking, you know what you need to get out of this data set, and I need to run this thing over and over. Every once in a while, you'll see data exploration, but not as frequently. Especially in the modern version of Azure Synapse Analytics, how they expect you to do exploration. So let's focus on those dedicated SQL pools. These are a massive parallel processing technology. The whole idea is you have possibly dozens, up to 60 compute nodes, up to 60 servers that are handling your data. And those can work in parallel. They can work in conjunction with one another. The benefit to that is I can have a bunch of servers working on a problem at once, and if I have a problem that scales out linearly, I can get the job done in up to 1/60th of the amount of time. In practice, it may not necessarily work that way. You do need to have the data laid out in a certain way. You do have to have the type of problem that can be solved in that certain way. But that is the promise that is offered. Also, you need to have the money to afford that certain way. Azure SQL Data Warehouse was historically incredibly expensive. Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools, not as expensive. The prices have gone down a lot so that they're now expensive, but not absurdly expensive. So it's an improvement. Okay, but why would you deal with hub and spoke? Why would you even try this thing? And I would say the biggest benefit for doing what Elias has talked about in the video was heavy concurrency. So dedicated SQL pools have a limited number of concurrent users. There's only so many concurrent processes that can run at a time, so many queries that can run concurrently. So many times I can use the word concurrent in this little paragraph before we hit the max, before we start getting throttled. Basically, we have queries that are waiting to execute because you got to get in line. So the big question becomes, will you hit that maximum? And that's your critical question. If you don't have a lot of concurrent users that are hitting your warehouse, if you can spread that load out, then you don't need hub and spoke at all. If you do have a lot of concurrent users, you have thousands of people constantly hitting that warehouse, there are other routes that could be available. And one of them, admittedly, is using Azure SQL Database Elastic Pools as your spokes. You can isolate your workloads out to those Elastic Pools and create external tables for each base table. That's an option. As an alternative, with Azure Synapse Analytics, you can also use a serverless SQL pool as your spoke. You could have external tables directly to the data in your dedicated SQL pool, or even better, they can hit data directly in the data lake. And the key benefit to this is I don't have to wait for Azure SQL Data Warehouse now. I don't have to wait for the dedicated SQL pool. I don't have to wait for that connection. I can just go straight to the data. If your data is stored in a good format, accessible for querying, and you don't have incredibly fast time requirements, serverless is a really good choice. So you create that serverless SQL pool. It's relatively inexpensive, something like $5 per terabyte accessed. And even if you have a lot of data, even if you have, say, petabytes of data in there, your average query probably isn't going to access that much information. You may be down to gigabytes of data that you're accessing, or even hundreds of megabytes that you're accessing, if you lay out the files correctly. So if you lay out data in the partitioned format that works best for your company, like if you're looking in date ranges and you lay out the folders by year, month, date, maybe even by hour, you have subsets of information, you've packed things down in Parquet format, you've done everything you need to do, you can get that cost down a lot. So this, I think, is probably a better approach than going with hub and spoke. As an alternative, you can use replication. Using the R word, just throwing the R word around. You can use replication or an ETL process to take data from your Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. I haven't made that mistake in a while, but as I tried to talk about history, now I'm stuck talking about SQL Data Warehouse. So let's try to stop that and talk more about Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools instead. So I can replicate that data, take that data from the warehouse, have it be my central warehouse, and then ETL it into Azure SQL Database. Have different data marts for business units, like that Kimball model. The next step is data marts that are business unit specific. Fun stories on history. Well, let's actually talk about that in just a moment, Mala, because I would like to hear fun stories. But I do want to try to finish up this question so that Fred has a reasonable answer. It may not be correct, but at least it's reasonable. My motto. So replicate out to Azure SQL Database and treat them as data marts. That way you don't have to worry about concurrency, and your business users don't have to look at the full dimensional model. They just look at a subset of the dimensions and facts. Or use Power BI. So if you have Azure Synapse Analytics, you probably have enough money and can probably afford Power BI Premium. Incidentally, Power BI Premium per user was announced at $20 per user per month. As an aside, $20 per user per month is like 40% of the amount that I expected it to come out at. I expected $50 per user per month, with the idea that if you had 100 users, that's about what you would, that's like your cutoff point for, okay, you should be on premium. And being just $20 per person per month really opens the door for small and medium businesses. So I'm excited. I'm legitimately excited about that pricing. Mike, you're nodding your head. What are your thoughts? You're on mute though.
No, that's great. I was looking at getting a personal one. It's also just similar to Netflix pricing, so maybe that was part of it.
That's possible, yeah. I mean, it's basically, if you have professional is $10 per user per month. This is 20. It's Andrew says $60K a month. So that per user pricing is really intended for companies that don't want to pay for premium, for the premium tier. So if I have 5 users, I don't want to pay $5,000 a month just to get these users premium tier. Instead, I'll pay $100 per month and say, yeah, I'm willing to pay that. For a company that has hundreds and hundreds of users of Power BI developers or heavy Power BI users who have to license all of them, yeah, just pay for premium tier. You'll save a lot of money that way. But basically, they had a hard ramp from professional gets you this, premium gets you this, but it costs this. So they have a nice intermediate story for smaller organizations that only have a few Power BI centric people. With 500 instances of SQL, that's peanuts. Yeah, and similar story. If you're pushing Azure Synapse Analytics and you're really putting it to the test, it's not going to cost 500 instances of SQL, but it's going to probably set you back mid 5 figures per month. So, at that point, haggling about Power BI pricing may be important, might be the difference between being over and under budget, but it is a relatively small percentage. It's not half of the cost, like 10% of the cost. So if you use Power BI as the spoke, essentially you're treating Power BI as your ingestion point. You suck in all of that data from the dedicated SQL pool, you ingest it into Power BI, assuming that it doesn't overwhelm the data model there. And all of your users hit that Power BI data model. So they don't even hit the dedicated SQL pool. Last option, caching result sets in your dedicated SQL pool. If you have data that doesn't update very frequently, let's say it updates once a day, you update that warehouse nightly, and people are hitting it constantly throughout the day, you can cache result sets and improve performance. Faster performance means getting people out of the warehouse faster, which means higher throughput. So more concurrency without having to do extra stuff, without having to set up extra services. And I think those are probably the choices I'd go with before using Elastic Pools as a hub and spoke style of model. And the other question that Fred had was, okay, if I am going to use Azure services, is there a substitute for Azure Synapse Analytics when it comes to cost? So if you're in that point where by a flippant statement of $50,000+ a month just scared you, or made you realize that you're never going to use it, note that that's, by the way, that's actually a pretty heavy production scenario. You can get away with merely $10,000 a month or $5,000 a month. That's still approximately 3 orders of magnitude more than I'm authorized to spend. But let's say you look at that bill and you say, ooh, a little pricey for me. What can I do? Well, Azure Synapse Analytics is really intended for large warehouses. I mean, they'll say if you have less than a terabyte of data, don't even come to us. Really, if you have less than 50 to 100 terabytes of data, probably better off doing something else. Azure SQL Database has improved a lot in the amount of data that it can absorb. And if you're going to be in Azure, let's say for whatever reason you don't want to be on premises, you could, for a smaller database, live in Azure SQL Database. Set that up in the right tier, possibly use hyperscale, possibly use serverless. I guess it depends on what your needs are. But you can get away with a lower cost that way. Staying on premises opens up a lot of other doors. I'm not going into them just because I need to focus this down somehow. But yeah, that is an option to keep in mind, that, well, maybe you just want to stay on premises, keep that warehouse there because you might be able to get better pricing for those servers, better pricing for the equipment, and you have the people able and willing to manage it. But let's say you do have a pretty large warehouse. Let's say you are in that 50 to 100 terabyte tier. Few options to save some cash. Number one is try to get your SQL pools, your dedicated SQL pools, as small as possible. The $50K per month number that I threw out as, hey, this may be somewhere around what you might look at spending, that's based on being at about 5,000 or 6,000 data warehouse units. That is a production environment that gets you responses within a couple of seconds for 50 to 100 terabyte data. If you set up your queries correctly, you set up your tables correctly, you're talking about a couple of second response times for warehouse queries. quite often sub-second, especially if you cache those the result sets. So maybe you don't need that timing. Maybe you're okay with 10 seconds for response time for a query. In that case, you can scale down that dedicated SQL pool considerably. My devs would make that 30 seconds. Oh yeah, you can easily mess up dedicated SQL pools because you set up the distribution wrong and you suddenly have a cross-machine sending of data where you're just splaying data all over the machines. And instead of having 60 machines solve one problem, you have 60 machines solve 60 problems. Then it's slow. Don't do that, people. You could use serverless. So basically, scale down those dedicated SQL pools, focus more time on serverless, especially for the one-off stuff, especially for the stuff that doesn't necessarily need to be built into that dedicated pool. If you only run a query once a day or once a week, it may not make sense to ingest a lot of new data and scale this thing just to have that one query be faster. Run it over in the SQL pool, or the serverless SQL pool. And you could also use Power BI Premium. Scale down that dedicated SQL pool, use Power BI Premium, ingest the data, treat that almost as people used to treat analysis services. I mean, you could use Azure Analysis Services, but the idea here is to save money, not to spend a lot of extra money. Also, another way to save money actually is to pause those dedicated SQL pools. So if you have office hours, all of our people are in these 12 hours of the day. You can pause the dedicated SQL pool, then you don't collect charges for it. So that way you cut the price in half if you're using Paygo. If you've bought a reserved instance, there's really no value in turning the thing off or pausing it. You might as well just have it run 24/7. You paid for 24/7. So it's no longer hourly. It's basically, you've paid this amount. Have fun. Those are my thoughts, Fred. Hopefully that helps you out. And hopefully you're watching tonight. If you're not watching tonight, I will have it on the Shop Talk show notes. shoptalk.tripass.org. Now, Mala, you had fun stories.
Yeah, sort of. When they started this whole thing with parallel data warehouse, I think it was in the days of 2008, if I recall. That was the first time they came out with that thing. It was
2010,
insanely, it was insanely expensive. I think they made like 4 or 5 towers. Then nobody would buy them. I think one tower somebody bought, but nobody would buy the rest. So this media company, who shall stay unnamed, they bought one of it. They're based out of Chicago, and they bought one of it. And Microsoft didn't know what to do with the rest, so they gave them a second one for free. So I interviewed incidentally for a DBA role at that place, and I had the opportunity to look at those things and see how they work. Like they came with, it was mostly fancy hardware. They came with a handful of DMVs that were custom written for them. So you basically had to know where to put your files on that tower and how to use those DMVs. That's literally what your job was as a DBA, taking care of those things. So there was an MVP back then who lived where I lived, who was the reason I got to see that and interview there. And he thought this would be, it's a rare opportunity and such, but somehow I didn't see that thing evolving. So not to mention the fact that that media company is not known to be a great employer or a great service provider or great anything. So I declined the job offer, and he wasn't very happy with me for that. But that's a different story. But I saw how those towers looked like the old IBM mainframes. So
lot of lights and twinkling stuff and everything, and they showed me how it worked and thing, and that's what is currently evolved into whatever Azure has now. But the 5 pieces they made that would not sell. That's the joke. That's the story.
Yeah, as
And
far as parallel data warehouse goes, I think the only person I ever saw really blogging about it was Rob Farley.
this person who took me to the interview was a young man who was very taken by it, and he got his MVP because of promoting that as a cause.
Okay, so there were 2 people.
They
I
were at
remember
least
Rob.
yeah. I think they were, a few others randomly interested, but people quickly figured that this is not meant to scale or become very popular just because of how insanely priced it was. But nobody would throw that much of money at, and nobody knew how Microsoft planned to upgrade this hardware or evolve it or anything at that stage. Nobody had any confidence in that.
Yeah, TG says the hardware was crap. When it was finally available, you could buy a single server machine that was faster. Or build a single machine that was faster. Yeah.
Yep.
So I had the opportunity to talk to a person within Microsoft who will remain nameless and role remain unnamed because I don't want to out anybody. Who's talking about the PDW days and basically agreed that that was just a pile of junk that was foisted upon a few customers, but hey, someone gave them a big sack of money and said, we want this. It was pretty early on in the Hadoop days, and I thought it was a really cool research project out of Microsoft Research of how do you integrate Hadoop with SQL Server. I mean, this later became the basis for Polybase, and I never had a chance to look at that hardware because I couldn't afford to look at it. Even after it was renamed, the analytic platform system or whatever they called it, didn't matter. Still couldn't afford to look at it. It was insanely expensive. Like I'm happy to work with Enterprise Edition. I don't want to work with an edition short of Enterprise. I'm expensive that way. I would get laughed out of a room if I ever suggested this. If they sold just the software, it could have stood a chance. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what Microsoft did in 2016 when they said, okay, we'll bring Polybase out. The issue that they had, a couple issues, but I think the biggest one that they had by that point, not the same thing. All right, I know. It's because it's not massive parallel processing of SQL Server. And that was part of one of the 2 issues that they had. No MPP support on SQL Server. And the other issue was that by this point in time, Hadoop was already being supplanted by Apache Spark as that central engine. So the Hadoop-style MapReduce jobs were really slow compared to what people were already experiencing with Tez, with later versions of Hive, with early versions of Spark. So the performance wasn't there, and the SQL MPP wasn't there. They did bring that SQL MPP concept into Azure SQL Data Warehouse and kind of took away a lot of the Hadoop component, the explicit Hadoop component, and priced it at an amount that made it difficult for people to use. The price did go down with Azure Synapse Analytics, so maybe, but there is a problem where, well, they have a difficult time hitting the market at the right time to ignite people's interest. And even if you have a reasonable product, if you hit too late, sucks to be you.
Right.
As far as Polybase goes, I think I looked at it as, yeah, Polybase and SQL Server Enterprise Edition or Standard Edition, the good first step. They did make an improvement in 2019 by basically bringing in a new product. And I do see improvements in Azure. I'm waiting to see them on premises. So it all depends on the data being ingested and used. If you're not pushing petabytes, the dollars don't make sense. Right. I'd say it doesn't have to be petabytes, but you know, if you're talking hundreds of gigabytes, it does not make sense to use Azure SQL Data Warehouse. Or did it again. Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pools. Except in a rare scenario. So Grant Fritchie actually had a blog post about at Redgate back when it was Azure SQL Data Warehouse. He had built this thing and they only had about a gig's worth of data, but there were some real ease of use benefits from using the product. And basically their trade-off was, we're going to do our processing using this and then bring the resulting data out into Azure SQL Database. And you can query Azure SQL Database all you want. It'll be a lower tier. It'll be a fairly cheap instance. And so they only paid for an hour a day or so of Azure SQL Data Warehouse and 24 hours a day or whatever of an Azure SQL Database. And if you're talking relatively smaller data sets or where you can break it out into data marts for business units, that dedicated pool doesn't necessarily have to be on 24/7. Not unless you have constant updating, constant real-time streaming or near real-time processing. You do? All right, pony up the cash. But you know, you have a more expensive problem by nature. Doesn't matter if you're on premises or in the cloud, you're going to pay more money for that regardless. What was that article again? Let me clack, clack, clack my keyboard while I do that, while I find this.
DBA, right?
Yeah, it was, I remember it was Grant Fritchie. It was on the Scary DBA blog.
Well, I did like the little piece that you had about being a niche MVP. Maybe that's my path. I could be like an MVP in like Teams forums or something very specific.
Yeah, that's not a bad idea, Mike.
Or like the calendar template in Microsoft Word.
Although what they ask of, from what I know at least, what you have to do to get to be an MVP now is a whole lot bigger and higher than what it used to be. And I don't know. My personal thought is I don't have time for that.
Yeah, it can. There's definitely a lot of time that can be spent advocating.
It's one thing if you work at a place that actually supports all that in a big way, like you work for vendors, Sentry One or Redgate or that kind of stuff, or consulting companies like DCAC and places like that, because they have a lot to gain from that title. You work for a regular regular shop like where Kevin and I work and such. And it's not easy to find that time.
That is true.
Yeah.
What's interesting is I've had unnamed product team people say they like having some MVPs who are at regular companies because
Oh, of course they do.
yeah, consultants have their own views and
Right.
They can kind of be outside of the norm.
Yeah. So when I was at Summit, the last Summit that happened, I actually sat with a few of them and explained the demands of, how much time you have to take to prepare a talk, to speak or write a book or whatever it may be, how that factors into your life and how it's important that unless your employer cuts you some slack, it's really hard to make that time work, or you sacrifice all your personal PTO and such, which I definitely don't plan to do. But some people do. I know Tracy does that. I can't. If I go home, I need 3 weeks off. There's no way I can do that. Put that down on SQL stuff.
Right. Andrew says, heck, I haven't even had time to blog in almost 2 years.
Right.
Yep.
I've had one full-time employer in my 20 odd years of employment who was okay with me taking Friday afternoons off to travel to events somewhere. At the minimum, you need the afternoon off. If not,
Right.
sometimes, depending on where you go, the whole of Friday off. But there was only one employer in my history who actually said that was okay. Most of them said you have to take, time off, and even if you were willing to take time off every other Friday and such, would not work for them.
Yeah, I've had my prior company in pharma, I would not have the time to do any of this type of stuff. So I'm grateful for that.
Right. So Raymond, I'm still looking for this post and I cannot find it. I remember it was several years ago, but I am having the toughest time figuring out where it is. Incidentally, Raymond also says, don't forget about the family parts. Yeah, families are important.
My plant's right there.
Yep, exactly. It's good to spend at least like 10 minutes a day with a family. So, anyhow, we are getting pretty close to the end of our first shop talk at 6 p.m. And let me know what you think about shop talk at 6 p.m. We're probably going to stick with this for the time being, this early hour. And if it is absolutely important to you and you had to like it better than 7, that's good. Yeah, originally the idea of 7 o'clock was everybody would be home and available, and we just had kind of an hour of, hey, everybody's eaten probably, so let's just get together. But we'll see. Back to warehousing. Building a data warehouse with examples in SQL Server. It's a bit dated but has solid basics. Covers theory, design, and implementation in an approachable manner that you can apply immediately. For other bits that could help as a backfill. So, that URL has a period at the end, which is really saddening. This is the book that, this is the book that Malo is interested in. So it's €50 if you buy it right now.
Oh my.
If you go to the US, it's $54.99. Now, don't worry, Raymond. Twitch has a bad habit of taking those periods seriously at the end of a URL instead of treating them as punctuation marks. So that is the book, Building a Data Warehouse with Examples in SQL Server. It is from 2008. But that said, it's not like the Kimball model has changed that much in the past 20 years. There have been minor changes, but for the most part, pretty stable. Incidentally, one change that I do want to mention, something that if you look at the old Kimball books, the original books, when he talked about dates and times, early on they recommended having a date dimension and a time dimension. And the reason to have them separate was that way you don't have all dates and all times as part of your processing. You wouldn't be able to aggregate it very well. So if you break it down to the date level, having a date and a date warehouse key works extremely well. The time level has always been kind of a difficulty with the Kimball model. And it sounds like the current advice for dates and times, if you need the date and time, is 1, have a date warehouse key. 2, store the date and time together as a different column. Basically, you can still aggregate on the date. Like if you roll up to the hour, you could have a date that has that date plus that hour, and then 0000. And that is generally better advice than trying to include date and time, because that makes querying harder and it just makes processing more difficult for everybody. Also, it's rare that people want to slice by time without date. So it's rare that people want to look at, show me everything in the 11 o'clock hour, when instead they really say, show me everything from the 1st through the 5th, 9 a.m. through the 5th at 9 a.m. So usually you're interested in the date and time range. But if you're really interested in slicing by hour, like I need to know all the people who walk in the door between the hours of 11 and 12.
Right.
In that case, you could have a separate time dimension. But this is a lot less common than the normal use case of I'm actually interested in date ranges. Tell that to the SQL Server Reporting Services execution log tables. That is example number 5 that I can give of the people who develop databases for Microsoft don't know anything about databases. Just check in MSDB, check the TFS databases, check SharePoint. SCOM, yep. Like even within the SQL Server product, a lot of the people in SQL Server who develop the database don't know how to use databases. They know how to develop databases really well. They don't know how to use them for anything. And
according to at least one person fairly prominent in community said they are not given database resources, so the developers do what they can, which was like pretty hilarious to hear.
yeah. I mean, you'll get a lot of people who are really good at this who are in the PM side.
Right.
So you'll talk to them. Our friend, former Raleigh person, Brian Carrig. He's one of the PMs for Microsoft. He's a great person. We had Arvind here last week. Arvind knows a huge amount about working with databases. But the developers, the actual developers, they're not writing in SQL. They're developing in C++ and C# and those types of languages. So when they do have to write SQL code, it's usually not good.
Nope.
SharePoint is number 1. SharePoint is number 1 with a bullet. And on that note, let's call it an evening. Thank you, everybody, for catching us for this episode of Shop Talk. We will see you again in 2 weeks. Remember, tomorrow, we've got Gilda Alvarez talking to us. So check that out, meetup.com/trypass. Drop a link in there, just in case you don't know where we're at. Surviving the work from home burnout is her topic. So check her out tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. And take care, everyone.